we have Sean Anderson speaking on the future clouds of crisis, intersection of opioid use and teen vaping. So this is a free educational event brought to you by Northeast Delta Human Services, LDH, Office of Behavioral Health, and Foundation for Wellness. It is accredited for 1.5 hours for AMA PRI Category 1 credits, ADRA, social worker, and LPC. So neither of our speakers or members of the planning committee have any financial disclosures. A little bit about a speaker before we turn over the floor to him. Sean Anderson is a licensed clinical social worker and a psychotherapist based in Metairie. He is the founder of Sean Anderson Therapy, LLC, where he provides individual, couples, family, and group therapy to clients ages 9 and up. His areas of expertise include trauma, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, grief, emotional regulation, and more. Sean previously worked at River Oaks Psychiatric Hospital for 5 years, specializing in mental health and dual diagnosis treatment, including 3 years in the eating disorder program. He holds a Master of Social Work from Tulane University and a Bachelor's of Psychology from the University of New Orleans. He is trained in CBT, DBT, narrative therapy, emotionally focused therapy, and other evidence-based approaches. So thank you so much, Sean, for being here.
Absolutely. Well, good morning, everybody. Let me share the screen here and we can get underway. I hope everybody is having a great Wednesday. Welcome to Future Clouds of Crisis, the intersection of opioid use and teen vaping. I'm Sean, as Ashley's already mentioned. I've been working in the field for over 10 years. I worked at a psychiatric hospital. I worked all of the units of the hospital, including, a detox unit, adult substance abuse, child and adolescent unit. My longest tenure during my time with River Oaks was in their longer term program. Average length of stay was 5 to 8 weeks. And that was with the trauma and eating disorder specialty units. So I do treat, I will occasionally go down to 9, but generally speaking, 11 and up, all the way up. And my average length of treatment is about 6 to 8 months. Generally speaking, it is CBT based, but I will fold in approaches all over the spectrum to meet client needs. First order of business, as Ashley's already mentioned, I have no financial disclosures. So, let's knock that one out of the way. All right. So what can you expect in this presentation, right? So you should be able to understand the trends in adolescent vaping and opioid misuse. You should be able to, look at potential correlations and casual or even causal factors. Y'all will have to bear with me. I am both dyslexic and dysgraphic. So I have definitely proofread this a whole bunch of times, but, things always get missed. Examine policy and prevention strategies and the reasons behind why it matters. Public health crisis, rising rates of polysubstance use, and the long-term societal and economic costs. So let's dive right in. There we go. All right. Vaping, according to the CDC, is a method to utilize chemical introduction to the body. Right? In 2024, an estimated 1.63 million adolescents are using e-cigarettes or vapes. Teens tend to point to curiosity, taste, and pleasure for why they begin use. Nicotine is, depending on the study that you're looking at, seen as either the most addictive chemical to the third most, but it still rates pretty high up. At third most, right? Predominantly, studies nowadays are pointing more to opioid use, but we'll get into kind of the reasonings behind some of that as the presentation continues. So let's define vapes, so that we know where we're going with this. A vaping pen aerosolizes vape liquid to be absorbed into the lungs to enter the bloodstream. Common chemicals utilized in these devices are nicotine and tetrahydrocannabinol. Conditions generally associated with THC vaping, when it is THC vaping, are lung injury, which is also EVALI, or e-cigarette or vaping use associated lung injury. Focusing in on nicotine, though, nicotine stimulates increased production of dopamine levels in the brain. Prolonged exposure to this chemical can alter pathways for stress, learning, and self-restraint. Withdrawal symptoms from nicotine have been observed in research and kind of, not as significant, but somewhat connected to what is observed in opioid, cocaine, and even alcohol withdrawals. So in this presentation, you're going to see a whole bunch of infographics. I'm doing this purposefully, right? Basically, when you are working with adolescents, one of the biggest problems is most adolescents have a tendency, as I'm sure many of you in your practices know, to observe any information from us as we are talking at them rather than to them. We need to get information in a way that's digestible and quick access, right? Some decent infographics can be very helpful in this. I tend to keep things handy. I'll do Google searches on the fly and hand them off, because as we'll cover later in this presentation, most of their information is coming from peer sourcing. So, they tend to be dismissive with things from teachers, parents. The infographic can be a really great tool, right? Some of the highlights in the infographics that you see here are things like 2.5 million youth in the US are estimated to be using vapes, with, another way of looking at it, 1 in 7 high school students. And that was in 2022, right? So 11.3% of high schoolers in the nation. Something else that most teens, at least in my experience, aren't aware is that the chemicals used in flavoring tend to create toxicity in our cells, right? You can even see in sort of the middle of the screen right now, some imaging of lungs associated with vaping, right? The damage, most teens aren't aware of things like this, right? These graphics are just some examples, right? You're looking at a graphic from T-Ever, which is the teen e-cigarette and vaping educational resource, and also one from the FDA, right? But be on the lookout. There will be little graphics sort of chalked throughout, because I really can't, state this point enough. They can be very helpful. All we need is to spike that curiosity. So why do teens vape? Well, there's a multitude of reasons as to why teens vape. The main 3 that are observed through research are tobacco advertising, the availability of flavored products, and social influences. That's from a study from the CDC. So we're going to get into these pretty detailed, right? Basically to understand what are the reasonings that adolescents tend to report as to how this came to be. So tobacco advertising is where I thought I would start. This is big tobacco 2.0, right? And it really does, when you dig into this, it sort of reads in the same way. What I mean when I say it reads in the same way is they're just doing the same old dog and pony show that they did back in the day, only now it's with vaping, right? They'll use alluring themes. They will make sure to place advertising in spaces specifically targeting their audience. So gone are the days of just seeing a television commercial or driving past a billboard. right? Now these ads come up on social platforms, right? Students reported seeing e-cigarette ads or promotions in retail settings. I mean, like basically 3 and 4, 74% of students. So it's getting out there. This graphic displays the fact that as they have increased their spending, they have um, they have seen an increase in use. So this is fairly significant. And this graphic is actually a little dated. Like this data comes from 2014. So, you know, it's a it's ever on the rise. Now let's talk about like the availability of flavored products, right? Not only is the presentation of vaping a draw for adolescents, but the flavors tend to give it a normalized quality and create this sort of zone of safety and make it cool, right? These companies are using flavors like fruit, candy, mint, menthol, right? All of this is designed to sort of draw this in. Um, Most vaping devices associated with fruit and candy smell are how teens like tend to report feeling like normal using it. Like it's not a challenging thing to them. There isn't any sort of burning sensation or that type of thing, right? So the National Library of Medicine used a sample of almost 1,500 current e-cigarette users that were 18 or older, and they spoke about flavor as a common reason for starting vaping, right? 29.5% of the sample. So flavors grab the attention of most e-cigarette users. And because I'm not getting any of that like background sensation, any of that burning kind of thing, once I get past the initial sort of difficulty of holding the vapor inside of me, I'm actually drawn to the flavor, right? Then we've got sort of the relatively new kid on the block, which is social influence, right? Advertising and flavor profiles are large contributors to e-cigarette use. Social media tends to be the biggest contributor. Peer pressure, curiosity, and the cool factor of using e-cigarettes causes like our youth to want to use them. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, individuals who vape receive more friend nominations, right? Basically, they get more friends. So therefore, the people that do this are cooler in the teen eye. And that creates an issue for us, right? So that becomes almost passive peer pressure, right? There's always going to be curiosity associated with this type of thing because it's something that they are often seeing, often engaging with, right? Also take into account, right? This graphic is here to sort of showcase how social media footprint is increasing, right? It talks about how 1/3 of students that are in grades 4 to 6 have a Facebook account, right? That's quite a large percentage. And then you're looking at 77% of 6th through 12th graders who get more than the recommended time of 2 hours on screen every day, right? YouTube is increasingly more popular with kids, right? Especially with influencers gaining popularity and strength. Many influencers are even being picked up by streaming services like Tubi, right? Where you don't even need to be watching YouTube to, oh, look, there's my favorite influencer, and they're right there, right? So it isn't something that, we can shield children from to a certain extent. It's so prevalent, it's pervasive. So, what brands are reported to be like the most popular, right? Companies have a tendency to try and stand out amongst the crowd. So they will try to raise the kind of cool factor. The ones that the CDC recommends, pardon me, recognizes as the top five brands are Views, Juul, Elf Bar, Enjoy, and Breeze Smoke, right? And they sort of looked at this cross sectionally on Christmas Day of 2022, right? What a Christmas present. So many of the reasons that are reported for this popularity, right, were the accessibility, the style of the vaping pen, the flavor variety, or the disposable quality to them, right? Many of them are very small devices, easily concealed. And oftentimes, I don't know how familiar you all are with these types of things, but some of them have like little screens built into them and show little graphics to display when the device is in use, or interesting animations to show how much vape fluid is left before you dispose of the device, right? Oh, I jumped a little too far ahead. There we go. Okay. So, what does vaping do to the body and brain? What is the problem with nicotine addiction? So, nicotine dependence is a direct result of the consistent need to smoke or vape in this case, since I'm kind of, you know, focusing in on vaping. The association with dopamine and the euphoric joy in nicotine draws people in and tends to encourage use. Now, euphoria, not in the grand scale of euphoria, when I say euphoria here, I'm just talking about sort of this this buzzing sensation that clients will report, right? As discussed by the Mayo Clinic, nicotine increases neurotransmitter release, which helps regulate moods and behavior. Situations that trigger urges to smoke are breaks, alcohol use, or social settings. Use of nicotine or vaping tends to lead to respiratory problems such as lung cancer, diabetes, circulatory system problems, and a vulnerability to illnesses. In relation to the brain, the dependence on nicotine tends to lead to a less regulated production of dopamine. Therefore, the brain wishes for that happiness and buzz once more. So we know about this desire to fit in, right? We've discussed this. And then there are three essential influences to vaping that, I really want to push hard, which is the peer pressure avenue, the social media, and then mental health challenges, which most of you are already aware of. I feel confident you've been touched in this in some way in your own work, right? But the teenage mind really does seek this sense of belonging, right? It's actively looking for its tribe. So they tend to be heavily influenced, from stress, depression, anxiety. They're looking to kind of discharge some of that, right? And peers and social views will often push many of those levels far higher than they're used to. I mean, when I was a young man, not to date myself too much here, but like I didn't have to worry about 24-hour a day notice of commentary from potential peers, regarding my looks or my attitude or my thoughts or opinions. Now it's always there. Which brings us into peer pressure, right? A common notion presented about vaping is the demand by other youths. Vaping may be a way of showing independence or rebelling against certain topics that their parents forbid. Other reasons are the need to belong and pressure from friends or trusted adults that vape or encourage vaping, or even the idea that everyone is vaping. So you should too, right? So what I'm getting at here, right, is in my practice here in New Orleans and Metairie, the greater New Orleans area, basically, right? Every one of my clients is reported having some direct observation of vaping, if not use, right? It is prevalent in their schools. It's the number one thing or like environment that they tell me that they see it in, right? Especially with like the bathroom being sort of listed as the top one. They're definitely seeing this stuff, right? And that just curiosity about it can help this, but just having a friend or even someone that they don't even really necessarily know saying, hey, you want some? You know, I know it's been hit so hard, like from the 1980s and the war on drugs, you know, this kind of cliche at this point, you know, hey, try this, kid, but it's a thing. And they're being, you know, faced with it, oftentimes concerned of being ostracized simply for saying that they don't want it, right? As we talked about before, social media is really hitting them, right? From celebrities, influencers, promotional ads, but there's also misinformation out there about e-cigarettes, right? Uh, in some cases, even talking about like health benefits. It de-stresses you, right? It's less harmful than cigarettes. It's not as addictive as cigarettes. All of these sort of counterpoints. I've definitely worked with clients who have come and brought some significantly biased studies in an effort to try and showcase to me my lack of awareness or knowledge, which I applaud the you know, the attempt. But many times what I have found in these exchanges with clients is they've even created a list of what they see as bias sourcing, right? The Truth Initiative, for example, is often one that they reference, you know, oh, that's really biased, right? In the graphic, you can see that Juul in 2018 was marketing 55.4% of their ads towards youth-related content. I mean, that's significant, right? And then in this bottom left-hand graphic, you know, it kind of points to some of the teen opinions, right? I'm using this one to showcase how, you know, their view can be a bit skewed with the effects of vaping, right? Or even the consequences of vaping. Now let's talk about mental health, right? So most people talk about this sort of buzz sensation, right? Which is the dopamine release. But some, and in fact, even in my adult clients, they will report that they do it, you know, because it lessens anxiety or depression or addiction, right? Most commonly, according to middle and high schoolers, they are using nicotine due to feelings of anxiety and depression, right? And they believe that that e-cigarette is helping. When in actual fact, studies from the CDC showcase that when you quit these, you have a tendency to have lower levels of anxiety, depression, and stress. right? Sometimes with like adult clients and occasionally an adolescent, I'll even ask them to like hold their hand up, right? Especially when I know that they are a heavy user. And I'll note the shake and I'll tell them that that doesn't look like someone who's relaxed and calm. Yeah, I'm playing a little dirty pool. There's all kinds of environmental factors in there. But I'm attempting to raise their awareness that potentially they don't know as much as they think they do about what's going on, right? The graphics here, I have one pulled from the Truth Initiative, right, that shows that 81% of 15 to 24-year-olds spoke of the whole reason that they started using was to decrease stress, right, lower their anxiety and depression. But that 90% of the people who quit reported those symptoms were lessened. Oftentimes, though, many of my clients have reported attempting to quit and that they get that symptom spike. They start feeling how challenging and difficult this is. And so they don't want to continue it. They pull away, right? Before they start down their path of healing, like those withdrawals draw them back in. Let's talk about opioids, right? So an opioid is synthetic, natural, or semi-synthetic drugs that are typically classified prescription or illegal, right? They are addictive, especially, like you want to pay attention to the dosage here, but we know that they are, and they're usually used in pain management, right? Opioids in their prescription are becoming less prevalent due to the addiction history that they have, right? We're much more aware of what's going on now, right? But part of the issue, it's still out there. Oftentimes, people will use them even without prescriptions, right? Or an old prescription. So the DEA reports that 645,000 people in the US alone died from overdoses regarding the misuse of opioids, right? We have another problem in here too, which is that there's fentanyl lacing, and we're seeing it rising all the time. You've probably heard news stories about it, if not other sources, right? There's a public safety alert that's been ongoing for a number of years now from the DEA for fentanyl laced fake prescription pills, right? And of those fake prescription pills, the ones that they've collected, they've found that 6 out of 10 contain potentially lethal doses, right? That's quite a large extent, right? To consider that one of these pills could end a life, right? So since I went there, fentanyl lacing, right? Fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid, typically utilized in treatment of severe pain after surgeries, advanced stage cancer, but it is illegally produced. I'm sure you're all aware of that, right? And oftentimes it will even be laced with other opioids to increase their effects. So hospitals often report difficulty in navigation of treatment of fentanyl lacing because we're not talking about one substance, we're talking about multiple, right? And oftentimes like the patient themselves can't report what's going on because they're unaware of it, right? Counterfeit pills are definitely seen as the most dangerous thing to consider here. And occasionally I have worked with clients that have reported, well, you would know, like it has a different look. But I always try to impress upon them the realization that there's no observable way to know. right? And fentanyl lacing has even been seen in vaping fluids. So it's a very significant issue. So how do people get opioids? Right. Well, we know prescriptions still occur, right? I put prescription in here because I also want to point to the fact that there could have been like prescriptions in the past, right? Drugs that no one disposed of, right? Most households in America have old prescriptions just sort of gathering dust in their medicine cabinet, right? And that leads to some of those illicit ways, right? Getting them from friends or family, but also like finding them at a friend or a family member's house and taking them, right? The medicine cabinet steal kind of thing, right? And then, of course, we have the black market, right? Purchasing them illegally. It is important to consider sort of where these drugs are coming from, how they're obtaining them, right? This graphic here came from the Department of Health and Human Services. It talks about how in 2020, 50,000 people were estimated to have used heroin for the first time. Right? That's almost sad. No, it is sad. Can't even put almost there. Right? Now, these metrics are across the population, but I want you to consider what that looks like in a teen mind, right? Especially with that sort of background ego concept of immortality, right? Well, it won't happen to me. Or that, yeah, I know they say that, but it's not pertinent to me, right? It's sort of the way that their minds kind of function around some of these bigger topics. And they end up not taking the precautions that they should be, right? Not considering the potential risks. So, what are the main neurobiologic and psychological risks regarding opioids? Opioid use has a lengthy list of issues and risk factors. Adolescents are most vulnerable to opioid use as the judgment area of their brain, the frontal lobe, is still developing. Right? So, exposure to opioids increases the risk of addiction in adulthood and changes in reward pathways. Right? Long-term changes in reward pathways are a problem regarding opioids, considering the fact that the use of them can cause a person to actively seek opioids for the feeling of pleasure and peace that results from it. This dependence is an issue as adolescents will have this problem due to exposure to opioids and an addiction to pleasure. And we're not talking about for a small window of time, right? This stretches. These are pathways that they're going to have the rest of their lives, right? The whole concept of like consider there are certain chapters of Alcoholics Anonymous that impress upon their members once an addict, always an addict. You should always identify as an alcoholic, even if you've been sober for 25 years, right? The reasoning behind that, scientifically speaking, is the neural pathway is still there, right? The brain still has recorded memory of the use of this substance. The same is true here. And in that important developmental time for a teen, right, they are literally building some of the ways that they're going to navigate their feelings later. So it has significant implications to them, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So when we think about these risk factors, right, can they affect their mental state, performance in their everyday lives, right? Opioid use basically, excuse me, when we're looking for like prevalence of risk for them, we do look in family history, right? We look for mental health conditions like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, right? Because we know that this increases their risk, right? These brains are actively looking for management techniques. And so introduction of a chemical dependency, especially one the brain can't hide from, it makes it difficult for them to pull away should they actually draw into it, right? Teens tend to be more impulsive, right? They also tend to have some sensation seeking behaviors. So we know that opioids affect the reward pathway of the brain, and the reward pathway is important, right? It's the way that the brain gives us senses of pleasure, senses of relief, right? Even the way that the brain will sort of recognize achievement, right? Your reward track is pivotal to just navigating your day, right? Research shows us that uh, depression can be indicated in neurochemistry when dopamine and serotonin levels are lower than baseline, right? So opioid use has also been found to not only disrupt those neurochemical transmitters, but your memory, your attention, right? Even decision making. So you put all of this together, just if you needed like further example, we've known this for a long time. Decreased performance in school is something that you can expect, right? A reduced ability to emotionally regulate. Things like that are going to be what to sort of look for here, right? Now, I'd be remiss if I'm talking about the intersection of opioid use and vaping if I did not bring up Robert DuPont and the gateway theory, right? Now, I know this is hotly debated, and I understand why, but it is important to mention, right? So essentially, the theory talks about how when I begin utilizing a substance, it predisposes me to the potential of using another substance, right? The gateway drug, as it is more often referenced in like news media, right? So an adolescent has a vulnerability that really comes to the surface when they have exposure to opioids. How this relates to vaping is remember that vaping also fires that reward track, right? That nicotine stimulates that release. So we're talking about similar systems, right? Functioning, you know, together in the brain. Ultimately, I'm getting more dopamine out of it, right? So to that end, it isn't like unheard of to kind of see that correlative danger, right? I get where DuPont came from with the gateway theory when I consider the neural pathways that are formulated in vaping, in opioid use, right? So basically, you can draw that inference from the data. Now, one of the things that is more often brought up to contradict this theory is that just because someone is addicted to morphine does not necessarily mean that they're going to be addicted to heroin, right? We don't have a straight line, but I'm sure all of you can relate to the fact that near nothing in practice is a straight line when we're talking about human behavior, right? So it is important to mention it because it is something to watch for, realizing that you've forged these neural pathways, you've created this association that this chemical allows me to feel more secure. So now let's talk a little bit about polysubstance use, that we have both of the chief focal points of this presentation, right? So polysubstance is just the consumption of multiple different substances, right? Like alcohol, medications, drugs, right? Two important complex patterns regarding polysubstance use are intentional and unintentional. This goes back to the lacing concept, right? Meaning that, like, I could have polysubstance use, but I have no awareness that I actually do. So when you look at the medical model of this, sometimes this can pose a problem, right? In treatment of multiple substances. From our perspective, um, from a psychotherapy perspective, I should say, the model can be very similar, but it's going to require some more information. We're also going to want to identify, like, when it's intentional polysubstance use, specific behaviors. But this changes the entire trigger map, right? If I'm asking a client to look at environmental triggers and map them, holy smoke, we've got more than one. The brain could have independent associations with each one. That's going to make for a lot more difficulty in finding these triggers. So I will often point clients to, before actively trying to find, like, all of your triggers, if you will, which I always tell them you're never going to, but let's get as many as we can. I give them emotion wheels, right, from Robert Plutchik, and tell them to try and track the emotional triggers. So we're going to go back at peer pressure again because, well, it's a big deal. It's probably the number one component that I see in my own clients, right? And across, when you do broad spectrum on the research, it comes up all the time. This one, I'm focusing more into the opioid variety, right? But you're going to see here very similar concepts, right? Adolescents reporting that it's cooler, it's exciting, right? That you got to take it to fit in, right? They get the buzz from the opioids, right? Your brain tends to feel more comfortable. I feel more comfortable being me, right? It's exceptionally common, peer pressure with teenagers, right? So the levels vary, especially environmentally. Most teenagers point to this idea of fitting in, and that's what sort of pushes them to that point of wanting to use, right? This graphic sort of talks about, like, how peer pressure affects kids. And you will see on the far right side of the graphic that the largest percentages are specifically focused towards drugs and smoking, right? And this is from, Teen Report. So it's fairly prevalent. Let's talk about addiction pathways, right? The neuroscience involved there. So dopamine pathways are the neural pathways that utilize dopamine as a neurotransmitter, which is associated with sensations of happiness and pleasure. We all know this, right? I often tell people it's the feel-good hormone, right? Dopamine is involved with the reward track of the brain. It gives you pleasurable feelings for certain tasks you do to survive, When we talk about nicotine and opioids, the reward system is interrupted. It's rendered ineffective because the nicotine and opioids produce the dopamine, right? So your body regulates dopamine less. Nicotine and opioid receptors are intertwined because nicotine gets that release of the endogenous opioids or the opioids that your brain makes naturally, right? Dopamine, incidentally, is an endogenous opioid. And this heightens that addictive quality because of the way the brain uses the reward system, right? Nicknamed the reward system because it truly is the way the brain rewards behavior. The brain, the way the brain gets you to utilize behaviors, right? A nicotine receptor is called the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, or NACHR, which releases neurotransmitters like endorphins, right? These are related to pain reduction, reward, and dependence. Opioid receptors are activated by nicotine, and they give you that rewarding effect just like your own dopamine. You get that buzz, right? But you're getting more of it. And because I have external means of sourcing that reward track, well, why do I have to make it myself? I can just put it in me with this vape pen, right? So the FDA has been working to try and regulate, at a higher degree, this, vaping, tobacco. We know about the tobacco regulations. I mean, that was big news for a long time. It still is, right? But like things like the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act of 2009, right? We've been working to legislate some of this, right? The FDA has also supported states in and cities in creating bans on like flavorings added to these vapes, right? But despite the regulations, industries are still resisting, right? They discredit scientific evidence. They create their own research, right, with implicit bias. They're using lobbying organizations for political influence, right? They even create groups and alliances to push back, right? So they're working to try and keep levels at maximum profitability. And since we now are aware of how this attacks the brain, right? You don't necessarily need a niche to hook it, right? Because once you've tried it, it tends to sell itself. So, you know, really makes things a bit more challenging. Excuse me. I get a little drink of water here. One thing that I like to relate this to is understand big tobacco has been doing these types of games for a very long time, right? With the introduction of vaping, all they've done is sort of shift their focus. So, it and you can see from this graphic, right? Public support for electronic cigarette laws. Like it appears to be working. Like the support is going down, right? From 2010 to 2013. I know this is a little bit dated, but like essentially speaking, we have seen, especially with the push to legalize THC products, it's making things very convoluted in trying to regulate any of this. And the adolescents are reporting, similar deals, right? I I can't even tell you how many times I have heard that well, marijuana should be legal anyway. So not only have prevention methods been made for nicotine, but we are also working very hard on the opioid pandemic, right? The Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, or PDMP, is an electronic database that tracks controlled substances in states, provides health authorities timely information about certain responses and behaviors of patients to facilitate that targeted response that they may need in that situation. Behaviors that are tracked involve prescriptions and dispensing controlled substances at a pharmacy, fill dates, the drug name and strength, and the supply given. Through this lengthy monitoring, PDMPs prevent drug diversion and abuse, right? Or at least that's what they're working to limit. And they assist law enforcement in cases regarding illicit use. They educate health providers, public health, and promote safer and healthier practices for a better community. So we are definitely doing a whole lot better in the dissemination of information and timeliness of it, right? There's always work to be done, though, quite a bit more. And the whole stigma associated here, right? Just about every psychotherapist, if not everyone that I've talked to, recognizes this as the disease it is. And yet, by and large, in the legal community, this is just a straight lace example of another crime. Right? There are also school and community-based interventions that have been becoming more and more prevalent. Right? So, tobacco education classes, peer-to-peer education, like peer-led group programs, basically speaking, right, to help resist peer pressure. Right? There have even been initiatives for national curriculums, right, like the Truth Initiative. Truth Initiative and the American Lung Association offer free national vaping prevention curriculums, right? There's counseling and support, all kinds of cessation programs, some in schools, but like online, good gracious. There's tons of ways, right? They themselves, like we talked about earlier with, watch out for the infographics. Almost all of these initiatives point to the need for knowledge, right? I'm sure many of you can attest. You can't help someone who is addicted to something that does not see their addiction as a problem. If you can't help open their awareness, that perspective is closed, and so they're not going to be driven to make that change. Right? So highlighting the benefits of quitting become absolutely vital. So all of these school and community-based interventions are wonderful, and we need more. Right? Other prevention strategies, and these are the types of things that I talk to my families about. Right? We want families involved. Right? So not just in school and communities, but we want a good home environment. It's going to help support like prevention of nicotine and opioid use. Or even, let's say I come into it after my child has already discovered it, showcasing that stigmatizing is not really going to assist you, right? But oftentimes parents and caregivers, they need some assistance in understanding how to communicate, about these topics, right? So, you want to let them know they need to provide accurate information. They should be open to understanding peer pressure, right? Even if they've been removed to a certain degree from a lot of that, because there is research to showcase that peer pressure is fairly significant in our adolescent years, right? But also letting them know that their ability to role model, right? I often remind families that, the oldest way of learning in the brain, and research sort of points to the number one way that the brain learns is imitation, right? So for any of you on top of that, I know since like the turn of the millennium, they've been working to prove that in adulthood it shifts to trial and error, but I haven't seen a study that showcases that difference. So mimicry still seems to top the charts. So getting them aware that being a good role model is important, and kind of being open to these discussions, right? We want to foster that safe and drug-free environment. Why don't people talk about addiction? Right? Regardless of groups available to help those suffering, stigmas and underreporting are problems that people face, ever more so in adolescence, right? Negative stereotypes developed against people with these conditions just make the matter worse, right? Terms like a junkie or an addict, right, have a big impact. Again, especially on our adolescents, with all that we've had to talk about peer pressure and fitting in. So, other things to kind of point here, right? Recognition of how this cycle of stigma and these stereotypes, how damaging they are, right? Is that marginalized groups that are associated with addiction, right? They get stereotyped. Things like skin color. For example, Black people in communities of color are more likely to be arrested for illegal drug use. Black people were nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than white people in 2018, even though both groups use drugs at a similar rate. It's unacceptable. People who are addicted to substances are correlated with impulsivity, unpredictability, causing a negative self-perception and less of an inclination to talk about it. The reason I'm finishing in this slide with that is the shame spiral is real. When we start introducing added pressures like stereotyping, right? Like this type of data, you're making it worse, right? So that's why I threw the cycle of stigma here, right? When public stigma leads to discrimination, prejudice, and fear, it's going to bring you in a damage to self-esteem, right? Hope, treatment avoidance. Then you start self-stigmatizing, which now we're in the shame spiral, lots of self-doubt, right? So your rate of recovery drops, as does your outcome when you go into treatment, right? And you end up using your substance more so that you suppress that negative effect. There is light at the end of the tunnel, though, right? I mean, nowadays we've got some pretty cool like tools, virtual reality therapy, right? Letting people practice coping in like controlled environments, right? Community reinforcement approach and family training to help engage those families, give them the information they need, right? Contingency management. So, like incentives for positive behaviors, like if you get a negative drug test, we're going to go do this, right? There's tons of mobile apps. I always screen apps, though. I tend to also recommend families do the same because, making an app is fairly simple these days, right? And then, of course, we even have holistic treatment centers, right, that do detox, individual therapy, and group therapy, right? Despite the leaps to help addiction, there's a whole lot more to learn, right? We have an extended knowledge base on vaping and opioids, but further research is still going to be needed. Longitudinal studies, things that are going to give us very detailed understandings of that recovery process, relapses, and the identification of risk factors, right? Or even protective factors. So it's important to mention like the complexities of that person that we're treating, right? Understanding that all we can do is track the trends, right? But outliers exist. They always will when you talk about human behavior, right? So we want to kind of continue research, get into those experimental interventions, right? So that we can start working with suppressed emotion, trauma, the other factors that led a person into that path of addiction, right? Some of the interventions that have been found effective, right? That perhaps weren't considered in the early days, like art therapy and play therapy, deep brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation, right? Even EMDR. So we need that work continuing and ever more so. So what should you take away? Right? The most crucial parts to know, right, is that vaping and opioid use are interconnected. Just think about the neuroscience behind it, right? A prevention model needs to have a multi-level like component to it. It's got to have it, right? We need every service that we can involved in assistance, right? And you definitely don't want like your clients to feel like you're talking down to them. Don't talk at them. The youth voice and input are critical if we're going to help someone that is struggling in this. So what can we do? Right? As psychotherapists or whoever else may be with us, right? In order to properly help those fighting addiction, you need to maintain that non-judgmental, non-biased support system, right? That's going to prevent those responses like the shame spiral. Most people in addiction, once they recognize it as a problem, they're shame spiraling themselves plenty. They need to start having an awareness that they're stigmatizing themselves. They are leading to their next relapse. Right? You want some good knowledge on the topic so that you can share that education to the client, right? The way that you present that information can be pivotal because you can almost sound it and make it, no, speak brain, you can almost have it sound normalized coming from you, right? Almost conversational, even though we know it isn't. But raising their perception to the fact that they don't necessarily know enough about what they're introducing into their bodies. Now, outside of that, I would be remiss if I did not mention that your self-care is pivotal too. This is grueling and exhausting work more often than not. So you have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself, right? Being in psychotherapy yourself, having people that you can talk to about this, maybe even creating treatment groups, right? For practitioners, so that you have some colleagues to sort of bounce things off of, right? Because we know as burnout increases, it becomes a little bit more challenging to stay non-biased. We want to monitor ourselves just as much, right? Now, coming up, I'm going to offer you all a little bit, like a little window into sort of the approach that I use with my clients in treatment and sort of the way that I tackle some of this with them. I have a tendency to give them some rather soft neuroscience approach on this. I use the science to help increase their buy-in to the material, right? And then as they start experiencing what we talk about, they start feeling more confident in being able to tackle something that once they've made the decision to quit feels almost insurmountable when they're getting those first signs of quitting. So I tend to give them this, right? Now, this is based in CBT. And essentially speaking, we talk about it from the basis of like a neural pathway, but I tend to draw it like a mountain where each one of these words is a point, right? And so first we diagram what I call an oversimplified neural pathway of behavior. And that's the one on the left, letting them know that before ever we get to the trigger, we have precipitating factors, the things that get us a little bit more trigger ready. Then we get to the trigger, right? That gets us thinking, right? Then we have emotion, right? Based on the CBT model of thought leads to emotion, emotion leads to behavior. Then I want their awareness for their preparation behavior, and at long last, the behavior itself. And after I've hit the behavior itself, I get to come down and I feel better, right? So they don't even get in the initial sort of draw up of this on my whiteboard, the thought per skill, emotion prep skill, right? They don't get any of that. We talk about the importance of that target of feeling better, right? And I expose these steps to them because I let them know that if they start tracking these things, they're going to start picking up on them in themselves. They're going to notice when this starts happening. That trigger comes up. Oh, I just got triggered. I need to consider an adaptive coping response, right? I'm on my way to the behavior. I don't want that, right? Maybe I missed the trigger. I'm suddenly thinking about using, or I'm considering going to hang out with that friend that does use. Now I get to change it, right? This is where the other mountain comes in, right? A neuroscientist's favorite saying, neurons that fire together, wire together. This is sort of the science behind how, like, once an addict, always an addict, right? But based in this system, I tend to tell people, so let's hijack that neural pathway. First, we want to expose it. The more triggers I can find, the more I expose what fires it. More thoughts related, the better my ability to see it. I can definitely find a whole host of emotions that get me wanting to use. My prep behaviors become my battleground, right? At least nobody I've ever treated had this trigger response and then their drug of choice just so happened to be right there in their hand, immediately usable, right? There's always prep. So like even with vaping, I will point my clients to, well, you had to get your vape pen out of your pocket. That's a prep, right? That's a battleground. That's a place that you can change it. You can set it down. You can tell yourself, I'm going to use a skill instead, right? When we cover the emotion in that second mountain, I let them know, realize it's the same emotion as on the first mountain. I draw them as mountains because I tell them that the emotion is prevalent throughout, even in the precipitating factors, right? We now know, outside of what Beck sort of theorized, that thought to emotion, emotion to behavior, well, emotion is constant. Everything stimulates emotion. So it's all along the way. So the reason I put it here is for the spikes, right? But I let them know the emotion is still going to be there. It's going to make it a struggle. I want you prepared for that. The reason prep is written on that second mountain is, well, there's going to be preparation for that skill, that adaptive coping response. Then I get the skill, which gets me to feeling better. I also draw it this way because I want them aware that the sensation change from using their drug of choice to feeling better is going to feel much more significant than the sensation change from using an adaptive coping response to feeling better. But it's because they climbed to a much higher peak. Whereas using an adaptive coping response, they started to navigate that issue before the emotion got the better of them. Right? So we do this work literally in session, and then I send them home with a relapse prevention plan. Pictured here actually is my adaptation of Beck's relapse prevention plan. Right? So it is still considered cognitive behavioral therapy, still considered the gold standard for treating addiction according to the CDC. Right? And after we've done this whole mountain thing, this makes the different columns in the relapse prevention plan very tangible to them, because I just put in the work so that they start realizing what this is, right? And it gives me the groundwork to get them aware of what core beliefs are, right? How they reinforce their drug use, the importance of challenging some of those thoughts, right? So that they can get some cessation on those automatic thoughts, right? I also, if I'm working with polysubstance use, they get a relapse prevention plan for each drug of choice, because I tell them we want to really isolate the behavior. I want to identify that specific neural pathway as best I can. I want to open up those stages as much as possible. Right? So this plan is going to allow someone to track the behavior. Right? I always also tell them that it should be a living document. It should change over time. Right? Because certain triggers are not going to be as impactful to me. So here we have the references, right? There's a whole host of them. And now I want to thank everyone for your undivided attention. And I'm curious if anyone has any questions, right? Or were there any topics covered in here that you got curious about? Anybody passionate about this topic?
We do have a question in the chat. Someone is asking, I'm sorry, in the Q&A, someone is asking, do we know the daily cost of vaping use? Wondering how much this costs teens and families.
Sure, absolutely. So here in the greater New Orleans area, the average cost is right around $23 for a device, right? That vaping liquid, depending on use profile, on average lasts about 48 hours. And of course, there are secondary markets to consider as well, right? Many people will, they isolate a place where they can buy the devices. So they'll buy as many as they can and then take them to schools and resell them.
Are teens able to buy these devices at gas stations?
So that's one of the ones where Truth Initiative points to the fact that gas stations are supposed to be regulated to only permit 18 and older, but not all of them do. Right? Also, sort of like back in the day, there were definitely stories when I was a child of you go find that adult that'll go buy you a 24 pack of beer. That is very prevalent.
Wendy in the chat says, in the parish where I now live, it seems the vapes are in schools. with THC, et cetera, and plentiful also.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the important note, like for that particular deal, and one of the things that I really try to impress upon my clients or even their families, this is a moment when, like, those adolescent years, you were learning how to navigate the big feelings, right? You're developing coping skills, whether you're meeting with a clinician or not, you're building them. I don't have to build them if I have a chemical that I can introduce that calms me. There's no need to build it at that point, right? So, for any of you that have ever been in a detox unit or a substance abuse program, think about the moment at which they walk into a room full of adults. And because someone was perhaps irate, the doctor has decided no smoke breaks for the day. The place loses its mind. There's no emotion regulation at that point, right? But it's because their variety of emotion regulation at this point is contingent on the introduction of that chemical. To a teen, that's exactly what happens, right? But they don't even have some of that, like, underpinning of that knowledge base. I
Is
just
there
caught that comment of sneaking use in class. Yes, absolutely. Right. I've heard the very same thing. And it's because they are so very concealable, right? So a teen that decided to give up, in fact, last week, gave me their device to essentially, they're using me for accountability, as so many of us are used in our practices. This is it. It's not even bigger than my hand, right? Think about how easy this is to hide, right? And this particular variety, right? This is views. There's the fluid, right? It's exceptionally simple for this to just be kept on the body and easy to use, right? I've even had teens tell me, if you hold your breath after you draw from the vape pen, when you breathe out after about 10 seconds, there is no vapor because you've absorbed it all. Like, that's teens being teens. They're learning ways around the system.
what other organ systems does vaping affect besides the lungs?
Absolutely, right? So there are effects in the liver. The studies aren't definitive, but the liver is the filtration system of the body. So, right, it's going to filter it out of the blood. Um, of course, we know the effects to the brain, right? There are early studies to showcase that opioid receptors increase. So we have more channels for the opioids to go in, much like you see in opiate addiction. So, like, essentially speaking, what that looks like over time is I need more to feel the same as I did, right? Oh, yes, I couldn't agree more. When parents sort of tout the information from the companies, vaping is safe or safer, right? It they don't have an awareness of exactly what's happening in my experience, right? Usually they don't know what that system is doing, right? So, but right now, medically speaking, really we're just dominantly looking at the liver and the brain right now. Longitudinal studies, there's a whole lot of theorizing that we're going to see things happening in the esophagus, in the mouth. You vapes, especially like things like this, like vaping pens. These devices we know are releasing heavy metals, right, in an aerosolized format. Things like lead, cadmium. These are coming out of these devices. So there are going to be implications, but the longitudinal studies aren't there yet to showcase it, right? We can't make the correlation yet.
Can schools do anything to prevent students from vaping in bathrooms or classrooms? Like what can schools do to help prevent this?
So the number one thing I tend to like offer both to families, or like I've had times where I've talked to like school counselors and things of that nature. I always tell them education is your key. Like I can try to police the behavior, but at the end of the day, like I need them aware that the behavior is not what they want to do with themselves, that it is damaging, right? So that information becomes that pivot point. It's one of the reasons why, like, I'm a big fan of peer support groups.
Someone's asking, is there any data on secondhand vaping?
Unfortunately, not a whole lot, right? Just because the aerosolized vapor tends to dissipate so readily. So, like, to have it in proper concentrations, you have to be in a fairly closed environment, but they're working on it, like significantly so, especially like people that are using vape devices and they're in a car, a long car trip, and they've got like their infant in the back seat. Like, yeah, there's going to be chemicals in that air, right? We know it. But the trouble is like studying such from a secondhand perspective, right? And what its direct impact is instead of like direct release. You basically have to create like almost the vape cloud.
Do you feel that the use of candy infused with marijuana is removing the vaping? I'm guessing is the question maybe is vaping not as prevalent because there's use of candy used with marijuana? Do you see that in your
Well,
practice?
so like definitely like doing the lit review for this presentation, I caught a little bit of like THC, edibles and things like that. Um, the real problem here, and I guess the important like take home is we're normalizing chemical dependency. Like, if I can go into the gas station and I'm seeing like a THC drink, like how more normal can you get? And we're not even putting like the THC drink behind the counter. Like there's a gas station not a stone's throw from my office that has it literally next to the door to exit. It makes me kind of right. So, that becomes the problem here, right? Is the same system. You're talking about the same system. I am using a chemical to regulate my emotions. It's not going to work. I need my chemicals to do it. I need to learn how to navigate my emotions on my own, right? I already know it. Like one important point I tell my clients, you already know all this because you weren't vaping when you were an infant. Like you've got the pathways. We got to re-strengthen them. We have to teach your brain that they will meet those needs.
Is there a therapy for only treatment for vaping, or is there a sobriety facility for vaping like opioids?
So, like a direct program for it, not that I'm familiar with. Um, But that said, I tend to find significant success with my clients using a CBT approach. And the research still points to traditional CBT methods being the gold standard for treatment outcome based, right? Now, I will often recommend things like Alateen, right? Just because I want them in support groups, right? That peer voice is important. And there are occasions I will screen particular groups because sometimes it goes the other way. I'm putting them in a room full of people that aren't ready to change. So I will tend to screen the group just to kind of let's make sure this is the type of environment I want them in. It's people that recognize the problem and they want the change, right? I mean, you see the same thing in like with adults, Alcoholics Anonymous, but we do have burgeoning things coming about, right? So like there are these um like holistic treatment centers that are popping up, but you'll find most of those holistic centers are very gun shy when it comes to anybody below the age of 18, at least right now. And in my experience, I think it's because we don't have enough data just yet to support outcomes. And we want to be real cautious with our kids as well. We should be.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering everyone's questions. Thank you so much, Sean.